Propaganda by the Seed is a joint collaboration between Edgewood Nursery and the Soulcast. To get 10% off of your Edgewood Nursery order of plants, seeds, and trees, visit edgewood-nursery.com and use Soulcast at checkout. And if you want to support the Soulcast, you can go to patreon.com/SOLEONE. Now, before we get into this episode, let's hear from some comrades in the Channel Zero Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome to We Will Remember Freedom, a monthly podcast of anarchist fiction. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to Live Like the World is Dying, your podcast for what feels like the end times. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to the jingle for both of my podcasts. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. You can find my podcasts wherever you get your podcasts or get them from the Channel Zero Network.
All right, Chris Homanics, thank you for joining us today on Propaganda by the Seed.
Oh, thank you very much. Good to be here.
How are things where you're at?
They're good. A little rainy. I think it's maybe some residual from the polar vortex that you guys experienced. Probably a little bit of that cold blob coming down and getting some of the maritime influence over here in Washington.
Yeah, it was a cold spring, but now it's summer.
Now we're right on to summer.
It's summer as fuck. So let's
get we lost climatic regulation, I think.
It definitely seems that way. Everything is more extreme and unpredictable.
Yeah, it's like, Macho Man, Randy Savage, like, oh yeah. That's what the climate is now, as opposed to some like it's like, calm down, 9-inch voices or 8-inch voices or whatever they used to say,
Oh my god. Yeah, it sucks because I just moved, so I remember what it was like 20 years ago when I lived here as a kid, and it was extremely different. Like, we didn't have deer ticks and shit, but from the year to year, I actually have nothing to compare it to. It was like just fucking rainy as fuck both years, basically. Cold. This year was cold. The wheels have come off. And there's no one at the wheel.
But you know what can weather the cart without wheels?
What's that?
What? Perennial Kale.
Oh shit!
Yeah.
Yep. I'm trying to seg here, guys. I'm trying to seg.
It's a good segue. We were typically we would ask you to describe yourself and your work, and then we would ask you about Perennial Kale.
Sure. And I guess I'm putting the Perennial Kale before the horse, and I'm the horse.
Yes, exactly.
But anyway, my name's Chris Homanics, and I love working with all sorts of different types of plants, and I've been studying perennial biodiversity since about 2004, 2005, and been actively engaged in the work since about 2007. And I started with annual seed production and plant breeding, and have over the years moved more to perennials. And I know that we'll be discussing like perennial kale and related topics, and probably some, as you were discussing, alien space vehicles and other nonsensical ideas. But I've moved more to perennials over the years. I've found that they're not less work. they're just different types of work through time. It's not where you have to cram all the work in an annual paradigm, but you get to meter the work out over many years. And I've been doing fruit tree research and nut tree research and just tree crop research in general. I would say in earnest over the last 7 years. And I've always had a penchant for looking below the surface of what we grow now as our common vegetables and trying to find what is the origin of, say, celery, or what is the origin of turnips, or what is the origin of corn, and behind that story, or in that story, are sometimes perennials, and there have been reasons why we have taken, over time, humans have taken perennial plants and either biennialized them or annualized them. But I think there isn't a one-size-fits-all model that works. But I do have interest in exploring some of the possibility of reperennializing annuals and biennials. I think that there's merit in that, and there's some downsides too, and we can kind of get into some of that later on.
Well, just cool. Just on the perennial tip, I'm curious. Is it like what specifically, like the thing that draws me to those things is like the idea of like decolonizing food and that the original perennial vegetables are like more nutrient dense. What are some of your motivations for like wanting to focus on these like perennials?
It definitely, speaking to some of that, it definitely can allow for increased accessibility for people to interact with perennials over annuals. It can be, let me qualify it that way, it can be easier at times to basically divide out or carry perennial material and allow it to reestablish in a new place than to have to create the special conditions for that particular species to germinate its seed. So that is one interest, and just from a homesteader perspective or backyard gardener perspective, perennials can be easier to deal with. One of the downsides is, the current way that we see our interactions between humans and land, and one of those is property ownership. And I mean, property ownership goes both ways, and I think it can be a nuanced discussion, and strike a balance between no property ownership and total property ownership. But nonetheless, our model of, okay, I have a farm, would put a fence around the farm, I'm going to feed myself from this plot of land, and, live a relatively sedentary lifestyle as opposed to a nomadic lifestyle. That kind of system kind of supports or could support perennials because you're established in a place for a long time. But on the other side, if you don't have land security, which I don't have land security, most people don't, and so putting perennials in the ground, the downside of that is you either have to move the perennials or abandon the perennials, or you lose ownership of the perennials when you leave, right? And sometimes, it could be a community garden, so it doesn't really matter, or it's somebody that you love and care about, or it's a piece of land that you love and care about. So, you can project, what's going to happen in 200 years? Oh, well, these trees are going to hopefully be around. Nobody cuts them down. If you're looking at, say, Aaron, we've talked about this, about planting nut trees and the prospectus of like, oh, isn't it awesome? 200 years from now, this is going to be ticking along. Nobody's going to know me, and that's okay. But these trees are still going to be going, and that's kind of a cool idea. But
kind of contributing to the commons.
Contributing to the commons, exactly. And so it's like kind of a collective ownership in a space, So those are kind of like some of my interests around perennials, some of the pluses and minuses of perennials. It's kind of a little bit of I went down through the bush a little bit, and hopefully didn't trail off too much, but that's kind of some of my thoughts on that.
I find that interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
Another aspect of, like, you were talking about perennials being able to spread work out over time, is I think on like a small homesteader backyard garden scale, it's pretty easy to hand weed perennials, which is kind of a necessary piece of work that reoccurs occasionally. But if you were to scale that up to, like, acres and acres, and not being able to use tillage to manage weeds, I think that's another potential downside. But yeah, for the most part, I'm really into the perennials myself.
Right. Sometimes if you have certain, say, aggressive grasses or aggressive weedy vines, like out on the East Coast, like, say, sweetbriar, or out here Smilex, or out here maybe our invasive hedge bindweed, Calistogia sepium, or wherever you are, you probably have aggressive perennial grasses.
And quackgrass.
Quackgrass, various rye-like relatives or wheat-like relatives, which are spreading. A lot of people up here have to deal with reed canary grass, and it's wet enough that the reed canary grass is according to the Army Corps of Engineers specification for what type of plant it is. It's indicative of wetland systems, but it's wet enough here. We get enough annual increment of rainfall that reed canary can recruit into fully upland situations. And reed canary is, reed canary can compete with apple trees. So, if you've got perennials, it can just easily overwhelm them. And some of, plants, especially colonal plants, they'll do quorum sensing. And so that means that the mass of vegetation of the plant, as it spreads, it will make a consensus about where to go. And the cells, similar to fungi, and the cells will grow into a space. And if they feel that there's a competitor, they may try to overwhelm it or damage it in some way, rob nutrients from it. So the case of Phalaris, the reed canary grass, it actually has the shoots. The end of the shoots actually have the ability to pierce fleshy roots, and they'll actually wrap around other roots and constrict them. And so they can slow down even trees from doing ecological succession, which would shade the reed canary grass out, or broadleaf competitors, which would take over the grass. So there's a whole world going on out there that is alive and intelligent in its own way that we're often not aware of.
Wow, that is really interesting. I've never heard about that. And I have seen that with quackgrass, where that really sharp-tipped rhizome will, like, run right through other roots.
Yeah, like potatoes, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. But I never thought of that as being a like strategy or tactic. I thought it was just like, oh, the root was there and it went right through it.
I think that some of it is passive. It's just okay. We are going at this direction, and boom. We'll just push right through this potato.
Yeah. Or
not that there's really that kind of not really that there's that kind of cognition going on, but there is research to show that plants use the organisms in their rhizosphere and to decide where they're going to grow, and some plants are able to hijack that mechanism and learn about their surroundings through the rhizosphere and make a decision about what they're gonna, where they're gonna grow and what they're gonna attack, basically.
Amazing.
So you could probably figure out what those things are and sprinkle the pheromones to make them grow in the direction you want, maybe 1,000 years from now, when they figure that out.
There's things like out there. You've got probably not as much in Maine, but you have the Pollinate trees.
Oh yeah,
and the Pollinate trees are very capable at reading the rhizosphere. So there's plenty of examples of Pollinate trees jumping across large areas to tap topsoil or water. There's an example of a friend who was dealing with a Pollinate tree that was cracking up his driveway out here in Washington. And Pollinate trees are not very common, and they don't recruit out here, but people plant them. And I like the tree, and the tree has a lot of medicinal qualities. It's a good materials tree. It's a good chop and drop tree. It's very coppicable. It's an amazing insectiary. So, it's got a lot of things going for it, as it's also, an ecological nuisance in other places. So this tree was cracking up the foundation, and what they discovered is this tree had moved 40 feet. It had beelined a runner directly to the only opening in his house's source system. So all the effluent leaving the house would go down to the source system, and there was one place on this entire pipe, because they had to dig it up to fix it because the tree really screwed it up. But there was only one place where it had adapted from a pipe coming out of the house to a pipe that went to the sewer. And where that gap was, the root had gone in there, but it had, when they dug, they had to dig the root. They wanted to get rid of this tree because it was causing problems and sprouting up all through the yard because they had cut it down. And then so the roots basically were shooting up growth all over the yard. And so they actually came in and dug a trench, a 40-foot trench from that pipe to the tree, and it was a literal straight line going across a kind of like a hummocked, grassy, like kind of thin, grassy yard that, like, the soil there was super poor, and you would have no indication that. What was the indication that the tree knew, okay, there is a tiny little opening that I can get in and tap the nutrients coming out of this house, like from a 40-foot distance.
That's amazing.
I know. So, that's the power in plants. But speaking, Tim, to your comment, bamboo is the same kind of way. You can train bamboo where to grow. So, for instance, when it shoots up its culms in the spring, you can break its culms down, and if there's an edge, you can maintain edges with bamboo. Obviously, you don't want to there's best practices. You don't want to plant bamboo next to your house or anything like that. But in a setting, where you have a road or something like that, and the bamboo is starting to grow up next to the gravel road or whatever, you can there's actually ways to control the bamboo and encourage it to grow on the other side by mulching the other side and feeding the other side, and bamboo will actually grow that direction. So plants can be tended in many ways.
That's awesome. It's like it's funny hearing all this like plant sentient stuff. It's like you could just see a collection of those news clips right before some shitty horror film about plants attacking humanity. God, that's cool though. I mean, there's that, I feel like as a vegan, I don't like thinking about plant sentience, I guess. But, there's like a lot of fascinating shit on it, that's for sure.
Yeah, as far as the water pipe story goes, or the sewer pipe, I've heard that plants can sense the vibrations of water moving through a pipe.
Right.
And that's a fairly common phenomena, is that even if there's no break in the pipe, the roots want to surround it because you get like condensation, essentially, because of the temperature change of the water going through the pipe.
But what I found particularly interesting about this example is that the tree didn't say like, oh yeah, the vibration is over this way, I'm going to go towards that. But it said, it was like, oh, there's a little tiny, I mean, this is obviously my speculation, but how did it exactly in a straight line,
totally
path of least resistance from the tree to the tiny little opening in that pipe, nowhere to go.
Yeah,
and
pretty amazing.
Pollinate does things like denature viruses, and it oxygenates soil at a higher rate than I believe any other temperate plant. So I mean, there's a lot of weird stuff going on with Paulownia. It also I mean, builds soil super fast. And it's kind of one of those just like Scotch broom or Japanese knotweed, or all sorts of other weedy grasses. They come in these disturbed environments that are close to ecologically dead, and while they're a pain in the ass, and they're a symptom of bigger causes, and they kind of cover over the earth that is being ravaged.
Yeah, definitely.
Chris, just like as an aside, I'm curious, do you if you mess around with bamboo a lot, do you ever like harvest your own bamboo and eat it?
Yes. To my knowledge, all the Phyllostachys species are edible. But I have a number of different species of bamboo. And because I'm just like a landless tenant farmer, if you will, kind of concept, I have a lot of them in pots. But I do intend to plant them out at a friend's farm as flood control. Most bamboo are not de facto wetland species, but they can integrate in the upland areas close to wetlands. So when wetlands flood, you can plant them in a place that kind of blockades some of the floodwaters, or at least slows down some of the floodwaters and catches the debris and begins to build a berm. And that's kind of my idea for the function of the bamboo on my friend's property. And then secondary is to harvest the poles and shoots. Bamboo shoots are amazing. Not all bamboo species are edible. And so I remind people to learn what bamboo they have. There are a lot of different species of bamboo which have poisonous shoots. So you've got to be careful. and they have fairly high content of cyanide in the shoots. So you don't want to just willy-nilly eat them. And you really want to cook bamboo shoots as opposed to eat them raw. Is the other thing. But they're delicious. So.
Yeah, I'm just looking to plant a bunch this year and just never met anybody who's actually eaten bamboo that they've grown.
What types you got?
I don't even know. I got seeds. But I couldn't tell you. It was just generic. I think it was what you just said.
Phylostachys. Like Phylostachys?
Yeah.
I think bamboo seed is not viable for very long, so I would get on sowing that.
Oh, really? Yeah, I got it last week.
They're fairly hard.
Oh.
They're hard to grow from seed? Yeah, I figured. It was like $3 on Etsy. I was like, fuck it.
There you go.
Yeah.
But, there's like a lot of... Yeah, there's like a lot of times people will try to germinate bamboo seed and won't get any germination at all. And I think that's because bamboo that I've seen that's seeded out, I suspect a lot of it is not really self-fertile, so it will create seed, but the seed is not really viable. Or it's seeding out because it's dying. So it got so stressed out. It's like, what am I going to do? Okay, well, I'll try this last ditch effort. Because bamboo can actually go, there's stories that I've read about generations of people waiting on their bamboo stands for flower. And they'll wait for like a couple centuries. And then all of the back in places like China, Japan, Korea, where there are a lot of different bamboo species, those bamboos take decades or centuries to flower, and then all the different individuals, I call them individuals as opposed to like clones, because in their native environment, they're highly clonal, but there are different genetically distinct individuals, and they'll all flower and send their pollen around and cross-pollinate with each other. And then the seed will be collected and germinated, and new bamboos will be selected out of that.
Amazing. Kind of like agave, could take decades to flower.
Yeah, agave, the century plant, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Those flower spikes are so beautiful.
Yeah, they're pretty amazing.
Yeah, these people just told me to put the seeds in the freezer when I got them. So at least it seems like they knew something about the viability, maybe. So, but whatever, they got their $3. It was just like a last minute, late night purchase.
Tim, I have bamboo runners that I can dig for you.
All right, I'm driving to Portland today. Oh, God. All right. Chris, you know so much cool shit. Are you an academic? Did you go to college for this stuff, or is it just a lifelong thing? Or both?
I do have a BA, BS. I often say a BA, BS, and BS, but I do. I have a background in biological sciences, and I've always taken a liberal arts approach to education. But I've never actually, other than studying some basic early on, I studied some basic biology, botany, some advanced biology, taxonomy stuff. I've never actually studied academically farming or agronomy or plant genetics. But I've definitely studied the subject extensively, but not in an academic setting.
That's awesome. I mean, Aaron is kind of, similar. He's not doesn't have a PhD in botany, but I don't know. You think you could speak Latin? All the Latin you're throwing around.
And folks, he can.
All right, well, let's talk about perennial kale. You know, I grew this last year. I grew a shitload of it. It was the most beautiful kale I've ever grown. It was like so.
Thank you.
It was like this really my favorite place to wander in my garden. Like the, especially like the ones with the really white veins. I'd never seen any kale like that before. Mm-hmm. They're just these crazy, basically X-Men mutant kale. And yeah, and it's just a crazy approach. And so I was just wondering if you could talk about the Kaleidoscopic Homesteader's perennial Grex kale.
Yeah, I mean that's a big seed packet we're opening there, as it were. But where should we begin? I guess.
Yeah. What do you think? I mean, I would say maybe start from like, you know, how you're breeding it. I guess, unless you think there's a more relevant place to begin.
I wouldn't mind hearing about the origins of Brassica Oleracea.
Okay.
And just a little bit of background about the species, because it's so many familiar crops that kind of fit in there. Either where the species comes from, and then how you started working with this particular gene pool.
Yeah. So I guess just to overview for people that don't know what the heck we're talking about. Normal kale is annual or biennial, and kale is. Despite what some people say, kale is a wonderful vegetable, and it has merits in the kitchen in that it is quite versatile, and it has a lot of merits for human nutrition, because as it goes for perennial greens, it is actually relatively high in protein. A lot of greens are kind of low to moderate in protein, and kale can actually have pretty decent protein. And so the Homesteader's perennial kale is a form of perennial kale, Brassica Oleracea, that I developed over time. That is really diverse and is reliable down to zone 7, though people are trying it in lower zones.
No offense taken.
And Tim will call your area lesser
zones.
Yeah.
Please.
Please, yeah. Well, yeah. So, anyway, Brassica Oleracea actually is a species that humanity has done a lot of work with, and has developed many different crops. So, Brassica Oleracea can include cabbage, collards, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, broccoli, cauliflower, kale, and we were before the podcast we were talking about Gailon, which is a kind of a flowering stem broccoli, which is kind of a separate, distinctive vegetable from Asia. It can include Portuguese tranchuta. Tranchuta are Brassica Oleracea that have been developed for a really thick leaf midrib that is like very crunchy, almost kind of crunchy like bok choy. So there's this huge spread of diversity in Brassica Oleracea, and if you want to save seed, you've got to save seed in isolation of one of those things, because they all freely interpollinate. And it turns out if you put together kohlrabi with cauliflower, you get neither a good cauliflower nor a good kohlrabi. So these things have been highly selected over a long time. And Brassica Oleracea actually sits within a lot of other Brassica diversity. So, it's closely related to things like turnips and rutabagas and radishes, bok choy, the kind of like the spicy Asian mustard greens, there, and a lot of other things. And they actually can cross a little bit with some of those things. But generally in a setting, in a garden or farm setting, you can grow those crops next to Brassica Oleracea, those different species, and not have any or very few crosses. So the history of the Kaleidoscopic Homesteader's Kale goes back to 2003, and that was when I was in school. I was quite sick during that time, and I didn't know why. And I only discovered flash forward to 2011 that I had basically sensitivity to wheat. And, wheat is not a de facto bad thing in my book, but it's something I can't eat anymore. And so it took me all those years to figure out what the heck was wrong with me. But in 2003, it took me on a journey to become a farmer and grow my own food, and learn everything I could about any vegetable and any fruit. And all sorts of different growing methods and soil nutritional analysis and reading the landscape and permaculture design and lots of other key line design, lots of different things, and just set me down this trail. So I started just in 2003. I just started picking up any book I could on gardening or farming, plant genetics, anything, and I just started reading it. And while I was in school on my free time, and I came across a book in the library one day called Cornucopia by Stephen Fasciola, and I was trying to learn about every fruit and vegetable, like I said, and here's this book that's like a indexed compendium. And so I just sat down and I just started reading this book, and it fascinated me how many different fruits and vegetables there were. And it made me realize that, oh man, we really took a wrong turn. We're not working with the plant diversity that we should be. And we'd be so much healthier if we integrated with so many different plant species. And so I started reading that book, and then around that time, I got in touch with a friend, Dave Sansone. We did a conference at the Evergreen State College called Synergy that I was involved with organizing, and Dave Sansone gave a lecture on perennial agriculture and forest gardening and perennial vegetables. And at that time, Dave was basically just on the cutting edge. There were just a few people that were interested in that subject. And some of them would have been like Martin Crawford, Ken Fern of PFAF, Plants for Our Future, Stephen Barstow, Frank Van Kiersbilk, Radix Roots, Owen. So there were Eric Tonzemeyer. So there were Jonathan Bates. So there were just a few people, Christopher Shine. I keep naming more people, but there's just a few people that were interested in these perennial vegetables and had done any research into them. And Dave had really put together some really interesting pamphlets and some other printed materials around edible forest gardening, and I became fascinated. This is like probably 2004, 2005. I became fascinated with that subject, and I found a document that in 2004 or 2005 from they're an NGO organization that promotes perennial agriculture in the tropics. I'm trying to remember what it is, but they had this these like publications on different species. They had like one for moringa, one for like coppiceable materials, and there's a bunch of them, and they had one for perennial kale, and I was like, oh, this is fascinating. And so that I was like, this like kale can be perennial. That's cool. I wish we had that. And I hearkened back to memory that I had when I was traveling in Hawaii in 2003 of seeing this, what I came to learn later was purple tree collards, and it was growing at this place called the Garden of Eden. And it was if I remember correctly, and it basically grew like a woody liana in the tropics, like many feet up into the tree, and never flowered. It just grew forever and vined forever. And I was like, oh man, that's fantastic. And around that time, I found Frank Van Kiersbilk's website. I think Stephen Barstow had turned me on to taking a look at it, and I got in communication with Frank, and he had several different types of perennial kale, and he's over in Belgium, and I became really fascinated with that, and I was like, man, I wish we had that over here. And then around that, by like 2005, 2006. I went and I saw the Bullock's Permaculture Homestead on Orcas Island, which is part of the San Juan Islands in northwest Washington. And when I went there, I made one of the friends I made was an intern at that place, and he said he had met this older English woman who kept perennial Brassica, and it was purple tree collards, and he had a start of it, and it was pretty fantastic, and I got a start of it. I took it back to Olympia where I lived at the time, and we had too cold of winter and it died, and so it took all the way back. And then it was like 2007, I got it again, and I was growing in a greenhouse, and I just became fascinated with perennial kale. And it was probably somewhere around 2005 that I first came in contact with a man by the name Graham. And Graham lives over in Cornwall and England, and he was UK. I think the Cornish, they wouldn't like saying they're part of England. But he was also interested in perennial kale, and we hatched a friendship and in basically studying perennial kale. And there's a few others of us that kind of came together, and we were communicating. One was Stephen Barstow, and we were kind of communicating back and forth about perennial kale and what we knew. And if you look on trends.google.com for the search phrase perennial kale, you'll see in like 2003, 2004, 2005, there's like a massive spike in search queries for perennial kale. And that was because there's just a few of us like searching different search phrases for perennial kale any way we could. And we'd find these different documents and kind of speculate how do you get perennial kale to flower? Where'd perennial kale come from historically? And it was sometime when I was at Evergreen State College during this kind of time, 2003, 2004, 2005. We had this older woman come in, and by this point she wasn't gardening or farming anymore, but she gave a presentation on perennial kale, and this is kind of one of these things like you know something happens and you're like bewildered by it or whatever, or fascinated, and all of a sudden it goes away and you never see it again, and you're like, oh man, I should have followed up. Well, I should have followed up with this lady, but she basically back in the 80s had collected in Washington, had collected all these different types of perennial kale from Europe and from North America, and where she was like crossing them. And she figured out how to get them to flower by just letting them be in the ground long enough and damaging their roots. And we're able to get them to flower and was like crossbreeding them. And by the time she gave her presentation, she didn't have any of it left. Kind of one of these ideas that, people are doing all this important work and they don't have any land to do it on. It's like stable. It's certainly not stable generationally. So, you got to move, and then all of a sudden you abandon your work, right? So it was kind of one of those situations, but I was super fascinated by what this woman had done. And so flash forward, I kept farming. I was like full-time farming by 2007, and just growing all sorts of different types of vegetables and producing seed and stuff like that, 2008, 2009. And in 2010, Graham had been able to acquire several different perennial kales, one, the purple tree collards, and another relative called the Daubenton. And so he was like, he didn't know why, and we still don't know why, but his area, for whatever reason, this garden, just the perennial kales, they like to flower there. And so he was having these chance flowerings, and they were happening almost every year. And he was posting about it. And I think at this time, plant breeding for permaculture had formed, and so I was involved in that and kind of following him. And I think there was some early posts there about these perennial kales that had been flowering. And so he had a garden allotment plot, and so he would have his every year he would plant several different types of Brassica Oleracea. Remember I said they can all cross. And so he planted every year he'd plant mind you, most of these are biennial, so he's planting a new wave of these every year, so the next year they can flower. So hopefully they're going to cross-pollinate the perennial kale if it happens to flower at the right time. And so he's planting like a Savoy cabbage, a variegated kale, a red kale, very similar to like red boar. It was probably Baltic red or something similar that he was growing. A kohlrabi, a lacinato, and I think I already said this, but a Brussels sprout. And one year, I think it was 2010. They basically lined up right and flowered. And so he saved seed from the Daubenton mother and the purple tree collards mother that had crossed with everything else. And so some of the Daubenton had crossed with the purple tree collards and vice versa, but they had also crossed with the Savoy cabbage, the Brussels sprouts, the kohlrabi, the lacinato, and the variegated kale. And so he sent me seed of those two seed lots. And the next year, he was actually able to get them to go to flower again, or they went to flower. And so the year after, he sent me seed of a direct cross of just purple tree collards to Daubenton. And mind you, these perennial kales, they don't produce a lot of seed. They're very, very shy flowering, and they spend most of their energy growing and not flowering. So the initial nucleus for this project began with the seed that Graham sent me, and I germinated a portion of that seed. The first year I germinated was 2012, and by that point I had been plant collecting all over the West Coast, and I'd been given a handful of different perennial collards and different things that people had in their garden that were perennial, and they were, some were like weakly perennial and some were a little bit stronger perennial, but they had a lot of like undesirable traits too. Maybe they were a little tough or something like that. So anyway, I was growing those alongside my 2012 plants, and at the 2013, somebody had come into. I was growing at a nursery in Washington, and somebody had come in there and cut a huge amount of my perennial kale down. And I think it was to feed some animals. And I don't think they meant any harm or anything, but I was like, oh man, this is like not the right place to do this. So I moved the very best plants, which is like, I don't know, maybe 120 of them or something, to another locale. And I let them all flower out with the perennial kales I had collected. And because these other perennial kales I had collected, they were more apt to flower. And so from that seed in 2013, in 2015, I did a massive grow out of plants, and I did that again. I just kept on doing that, and in 2017 I did another massive grow out where I started really honing in and selecting hard on the perennial kale, and that produced seed in 2018, which I saved from, and that is kind of the Homesteader's perennial Kaleidoscopic kale, and there's a lot more to it, but that's kind of like an abridged history of it.
Thank
awesome.
you. That's quite a story.
I love how you really gave credit to every single node along the, not every one, but all the people who you've traded with and passed the seed. Because that's an important aspect of this, is that it's just not one person. It's like this is being passed down and adapted. I'm curious if maybe I'll ask this. Aaron, did you have a question?
No, go ahead. I'll get mine later.
Well, it's an aside, but I'm wondering, have you ever messed with Western Front perennial kale? Because that is something I have had be perennial at Zone 5.
Yeah, Western Front. Actually, there is another person in the story that I have not mentioned that was very influential in my life. And still is, even though he's not doing that much breeding work anymore. But was Tim Peters. Tim Peters was ran the research arm and seed production arm of Territorial Seed Company back when it was owned by Steve Solomon. And Tim Peters did, in the course of his work, all sorts of really fascinating work. And he went on after Territorial to create Tim Peters Seed and Research. And it was from phone calls with him over the years that I've learned a lot about Brassica hybridization, Brassica genetics, his different musings on his work with perennial brassicas. And Western Front is actually a cross that was developed by Tim Peters where he was working with Brassica napus kale to create a perennial kale. Western Front was the Western Front seed that is available pretty much now all comes through Adaptive Seeds work, where Andrew still did reselections on Tim Peters' work to kind of increase the perenniality of the Western Front. And there's been several other people that have worked on more perennial forms of Western Front. One of them is Rob Wagner. And trying to think of who. There's been a few other people that have. I've never found it to be that perennial or that delicious, to be honest. It is interesting. I think it could be used as a starting point to take, like, say, my perennial Brassica Oleracea and cross it into the Western Front, or vice versa. And a little backstory about Brassica napus. Brassica napus, I said earlier that different Brassica species can hybridize very widely. And Brassica napus is actually a cross between a Brassica Oleracea, kale type plant, and a Brassica rapa, fodder turnip green type plant. And when those came together, that forms white Russian kale, basically, or the white form of Brassica napus. And then when Brassica napus, then that white Russian kale, then receives pollen from Brassica nigra, or the black mustard, a fodder form of that. Mostly nigra is mostly used for oil seed, actually, or for mustard. The seed is made into a mustard, but there are fodder leaf forms, and if a fodder leaf form crosses into the white Russian kale, the white form of Brassica napus, it forms the red Russian kale. And so the red Russian kale Brassica napus form is a synthetic species of 3 different species that are related to each other, that are all part of what's called the triangle of U, which is a graph which shows the interrelations between different Brassica species. And so Western Front is a form of red Russian kale. And he used some species. Tim Peters over the years was able to create a number of new synthetic forms of Brassica napus from, like, basically redoing the crosses and restabilizing them. Anyway, Western Front was one of these things, and it came out of a plant which was very perennial. And he said that after he found this plant, which was very perennial, it took a long time to try to recapture that perenniality. So anyway, it's an interesting kale, and I think one of the reasons it's worth growing is just because of its hardiness. But it's not really, from my experience, I've not seen it be really that perennial. But it could still be a starting point to cross-pollinate with my kale, but you need to do bud pollination between the two. They wouldn't freely open pollinate very well. And napus, actually, one of the things about napus is Brassica Oleracea tends to need to outcross. most Brassica Oleracea cannot very well inbreed, so it can't self-pollinate very well. If it does, a lot of Brassica Oleracea will create weak seedlings, not always, but they can, or they can after several generations create very weak spindly seedlings. But what's interesting about Brassica napus is because it has the genome of 3 different species in it, it actually tends to want to self-pollinate. And so Brassica Oleracea, Brassica napus, if you have a field of Brassica napus, most of the plants in this field, most flowers of most of the plants in the field will be self-pollinated seed. So if you want to make crosses with Brassica napus, you need to actually bud pollinate them. And by bud pollinate them, I mean that you basically open up the flower before it's fully open, and you emasculate, or you take off the pollen parts of one flower, and you take the pollen of another flower from another plant, and you bring that over to the flower and you pollinate it. And you got to do that, and then you tag it somehow so that you know, okay, hey, that seed pod that's going to form, that's a cross. Or if it doesn't form, you're like, oh, I failed with that cross. But anyway, Tim has spoken at length about different methods for doing bud pollination and when to do it and how to overcome incompatibilities between species and stuff like that. But anyway, that's a little bit about Western Front.
That's so cool. Yeah, I mean, it is. I guess you're right. It's not like a true perennial. It just kind of like comes back from the roots every year, but it's still a nice. Yeah, I've enjoyed growing it. But
how long do your plants live, Tim? Like, how many years will it come back from the roots?
I don't know. Now that I think about it, I don't know if I've ever been 3 years growing it anywhere. So maybe, maybe it's just biennial. I don't know.
So a couple of questions, Chris. What causes perenniality in brassicas? Do we know, like, it's this particular gene, or is it several genes? And how widely could you potentially cross your Homesteader's kale to other Brassica Oleracea varieties and potentially get interesting perennial crosses?
Well, I'll answer that last question first because I think it's the quickest. But so basically, any Brassica Oleracea in the presence of any other Brassica Oleracea flower will freely cross. They want to outbreed. You may get a few seeded pods, but for the most part, you're going to get outcross. So if you wanted to take my perennial kale and make a form of perennial broccoli, one way to go about that would be to first, I would make a cross between purple sprouting broccoli and overwintering cauliflower to increase the head size. And the purple sprouting broccoli actually has, from its genetic background, it has some perenniality and worth exploring. And so that cross between the overwintering cauliflower or overwintering broccoli and a purple sprouting spring broccoli would increase the head size, and then you could cross that and maybe in tandem to a good selection of my homesteaders and work on creating a perennial, basically a perennial broccoli. So any of the any Brassica Oleracea will cross to any other Brassica Oleracea fine. And then the genetics involved in perenniality is not well studied. And there's very little information out on the internet. about that subject. What I have found is that it has to involve a whole number of traits, and they're traits that influence how and when and where the plant is going to flower. And that's influenced by primarily, it seems one of the primary functions is how the plant distributes its auxins or hormones, AUXIN. An auxin is a plant hormone. And so it's how it distributes its plant hormones throughout the plant. And it also matters how much plant auxins, flowering auxins, that perennial kale produces. So a good perennial kale actually produces less flowering auxins than, say, a normal annual bearing broccoli. Annual broccoli has a lot of flowering auxins, right? It's got a huge freaking flower. So one of the ways, just as a side, one of the ways that I've made this population more and more perennial is by calling the plants which are the most vigorous flowers. So a plant with more flowering auxins is going to flower earlier in the season because it's going to be expressed to flower earlier because it has more auxins. So I've generally called those plants out of the population and prevented them from interpollinating. And then I've looked for plants which flower at every single node or almost every single node, and I've tended to call those plants. And then I've looked for plants that tend to branch at every node. And if you have a plant that's branching at every node and is kind of sprawling on the ground, then what flowering auxins it does have are going to be distributed across the plant and kind of diluted more. So the plant is going to be less apt to flower, or some branches are going to be purely vegetative, while other branches will be will create a flower spike. And that's what I see in naturalized Brassica Oleracea that I've found along the shores of the Puget Sound here in the Seattle area, and also along the coastline of Oregon, and also river systems. Are these kind of Brassica Oleracea? Brassica Oleracea actually tends back towards that kind of trait of being more vegetative and flowering when needed. So as for other genes, I think that it's a complex thing. It's what's called an additive trait. So it's not involving 1, 2, or 3 or a small handful of genes, but it's involving many different genes that influence whether or not the plant's going to flower and when and where the plant's going to flower, in summary.
Cool. That's fascinating.
And how perennial are most of the seedlings in the Homesteader's mix? Like, do you find that almost all of them are perennial and they kind of have different lifespans?
So at this point, I would say that more than 90% of the seedlings are perennial in the population that I've been selling over at the Experimental Farm Network. I would say that you're going to find your like upper 20%, which are far more perennial than the bottom 80%, but all like 90% of those plants or more are going to, after flowering, are going to keep on growing from shoots down at the base. But there's that like top 20 or 30%, which are going to flower a lot less. They're just going to have like a little side flower spike, and are just going to keep on bushing out and branching out. So perenniality is also affected by climate. And so so for instance, if you took a regular red Russian kale and you took it to, say, Ecuador, there was a post years ago by Dr. Eve Emschweiler, I think her name is pronounced, from the University of, I think it's from the University of Wisconsin, Madison. And she's done a lot of work into oca and looking at oca and how the different species of oca came together to form modern oca, and there's different flower types and which ones are receptive for which one, and some of the other genetics behind oca. She's done a lot of really interesting work. And in her travels in South America, she came across, because she was involved in a lot of these same plant groups that I mentioned, like plant breeding for permaculture and radix roots and different things like that. And she knew that people were interested in perennial brassicas, and so she made a post about a perennial kale that people in this place in, like, I think it was Ecuador, were using as a cottage food plant. And from other people I've talked to, there are a couple different places in Ecuador where and in Bolivia where there are these perennial kales, but the idea, as I understand it, is these are probably just regular kale that has gone to an equatorial region and now is confused, and so there's not enough seasonal variation, and there's very little vernal period, like a cold wet period, to stimulate it to flower, so it just has gone vegetative.
Interesting.
And as
endless
you take
summer.
Yes, and as you take like Brassica Oleracea kales, whether it be collards or whatever, and say if you grow them down in Central California or the Bay Area, they'll have, because it's a milder climate and the plant's not very stressed, it's able to produce seed, and then it will tend to keep on growing. But once you get into even zone 8, zone 7, it gets cold enough that the plant will basically it stimulates those flower auxins enough that the plant will produce enough seed that it will just usually exhaust itself. And that after it produces seed, you could cut it down and get some weak sprouts, but it's climatically is not going to be stimulated as much to regenerate. So, and as you get into colder climates, Brassica Oleracea eventually has a hard time surviving because of the genetic limitations of Brassica Oleracea. So there are a few kales that can go into zone 4 or colder. One of them I grow is called Red Cavalier. It's a really tall, dark red kale, very beautiful, very rare. And I'll be releasing that seed lot pretty soon. And it is also weakly perennial. And it comes back. It will sprout back from the stem after flowering. But as you get into colder climates, the other issue that you run into is that the cold, as you guys know, that cold will freeze up the stem, the tissue inside the stem, and it will kind of like explode it as it freezes and thaws. And then it will crack it, and stuff like fungus and stuff will get inside, or insects will get inside and eat that stem. And so that tends to like succumb a plant, whether it's my homesteaders or anything else in a colder climate. One thing I've been working on is developing kale that has woodier stems. So one of the varieties that has really woody stems is called Pentland Brig, and it can survive in really cold climates. And I think that those woodier, higher lignin stems have less of a chance of exploding in the freeze-thaw cycles. And one of the issues is that when you increase the lignins in the stem, you have potential of increasing the lignins in the leaf. And what does that do? That makes the leaf tougher. So I don't want to make leaves tougher. I want the kale to be delicious. So that will be kind of a segregate population that I'll work with in the future. And I think that will be able to extend the perennial kale into colder zones. But there have been some people that have had success in overwintering the perennial kale in colder zones by mulching it heavily. And then when the kale dies back down to the ground, they just cut it back, or they cut it back at the end of the season. And then when the worst of the winter's over, they scrape back the mulch and the plant sprouts back up. And my friend Michel Lacombe up in Quebec, he had success over winter. I mean, he's like, he's like US Zone 3
Probably,
or something.
Yeah.
But he had success overwintering some of my perennial kale, and they're actually seeding out right now. He sent me excited messages like, "You're having babies," and like I was like, "What the heck?" Because he's always so Michel is always so he's such a good thinker and writer and so creative. I'm like, it was late at night. I just like come in from a long trip, and I look at my messages on Facebook, and it's the first thing is, "You're having babies," and I'm like, "What? What's going on?" And then I start reading it, and then I saw his picture of perennial kale, and I was like, "Oh, Michel, you're always causing problems."
I got some of that going to seed right now too. That was in under a hoop house.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, same here. I've been growing these perennial kale seeds from you for I think about 5 years now.
Years, yeah. You were one of the first people I sent it to.
Yeah, maybe even 6 years. And
I think maybe 6 years. Yeah.
In the first several years, I had one individual out of 100 or so that did survive for 3 winters, including a really difficult winter before eventually succumbing. Unfortunately, never bloomed. But last winter, it never got super cold here. And I mean, it got down to single digits, but not really into the negatives at all. And I would say about 40% of the Homesteader's kale that I had planted out survived. And a lot of that is blooming now. And then I also had some in the hoop house, and probably like 60 or 70% of those survived.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the keeping ice and snow off them is actually going to help survivability in colder climates such as you guys. And I know, like, good parts of chunks of Maine are influenced by that maritime, like we are out here. So you've got a little reprieve, but I'm sure interior Maine, you'd probably run into trouble. I know Buzz, my friend Buzz Ferber, he planted out a ton of the perennial kale and has had no survival yet. But I mean, this was like polar vortex, Yeah. And I don't know if any Brassica Oleracea is going to survive polar vortex.
I think Buzz is a solid zone colder than I am.
Yeah, a solid zone 4.
Thankfully there are places colder than this. I guess it's the only thing that, like, as I mourn during the winter, I'm just like, it's got to be colder somewhere. Well, so what about sea kale? Where does sea kale fit into this? Is that have you ever tried breeding that into this mix, or is it too different of a plant that you wouldn't really be interested in it?
Sea kale is a cranberry, and in particular, it is Cranberry Maritima, and It is a completely different, genetically, it's a completely different plant. It's been on a completely different trajectory than the triangle view plants like Brassica niger, Brassica rapa, or Brassica Oleracea. My read of the genetics of sea kale is that it is from a lineage that eventually gave rise to like the radishes, and also a plant called kikile, which is called sea rocket, and there's other related plants. But it has been, the cranberries have been doing their own thing for a long time. So Cranberry Maritima, as best as I can tell, can't cross with any of the other cranberry species, and there's a bunch of them. So a lot of these cranberry species have basically adapted into their niche over many millions of years, and have been on their own journey. That said, there is actually a lot of diversity in Cranberry Maritima, and it deserves to be worked with more, as it's a valuable food plant. It's kind of like one of these eat-all plants. You can eat the root. The root kind of has a mild horseradish flavor when you process it, similar to horseradish. When you boil it, it actually has a nice flavor when you add like an oil to it and some salt. It's wonderful. The shoots, it's primarily been grown for the shoots, which were blanched, and that kind of promoted some of its kind of finer texture and less bitters. But the new leaves can also be eaten. The flowers can be eaten like little broccolis, either cooked or raw. Then after it produces seeds, it begins to produce seed, it makes a ball pod seed that when it gains enough lignins, and becomes like a woody round ball that will float in the ocean. And during a flood event, it will end up in debris piles on the ocean and root out or germinate there and root into that kind of debris. And so you can, when those ball pods are still in the green stage, you can eat them, and they have a wonderful crunchy flavor, similar to like radish pods or peas. Yeah. Anyway, another thing is that it already sold out, but I've been working with sea kale for a whole number of years, and I've done selection on what's called lily white sea kale. And a number of years ago, I acquired lily white sea kale from every source I could get it from, plants or seed, and grew them up and interpollinated them, open pollinated them, and then grew out that seed, selected the most vigorous seedlings, planted those out, found the ones that are most drought tolerant, let those go up to seed, saved the seed from that, and did that one more time. And now I have what I call improved lily white sea kale that I do sell through the Experimental Farm Network, and I hope that we have some more seed next year. My plants look set to flower again, but
I got that sprouted.
It's sold out. You did?
Yeah, I got it sprouted
in like 2 weeks.
Yeah, I've got sea kale's real. I've had a hard time germinating sea kale, and I've got I think four of I don't know, 4 of 16 or something, 4 of 20 so far that have been born.
Sweet.
So those are yours, huh? Those are awesome.
Yeah, the improved lily white. Mm-hmm. One of the things I do recommend with germinating sea kale is, so I talked about that woody lignified pod that will float around the ocean for years. So that is really impervious to water. So the way to get that sea kale to germinate easily is you take there are different ways to do it. You can use nail clippers. You can use a flat razor carefully, and you can use jewelry pliers, but you chop the side of the seed off, and then you can basically crack that pod open and carefully and remove the soft seed inside. And if you do that and plant those seeds right away, because they'll dry out very quickly outside of the pod, but if you plant them right away, you'll get germination, and it will you'll get germination fairly readily over about a 2-month period.
That's awesome. Yeah, I didn't know you bred that, so I guess I'm growing a couple of your things.
Cool.
That's awesome. Aaron, what do you got? I didn't mean to jump off the Brassica tip. I didn't know or the Brassica Oleracea tip. I don't know if you have any more questions about the breeding stuff, Aaron, or any more questions?
Yeah. No, I think we got a lot of great information there. One other thing I wanted to ask you to just go over a tiny bit, Chris, is the Agrarian Sharing Network, because I know that's something you're involved in, and I think it's a really cool project, and I think people might be interested to hear a little bit about it.
Sure. So the Agrarian Sharing Network, or ASN, is a group that I founded with my friend Nicholas Rutledge back in 2017. I had been involved for a couple years in what was called the Lane County Plant Propagation Fair, which happened every year in the city of Eugene, Oregon. And Eugene happens to be in Lane County. And so people from all over Lane County and beyond would come, and it was a grafting fair. And so material would be collected from various different orchards, including Nick Botner's apple collection of 4,500 apple varieties, and the pears from the National Pear Repository in Corvallis at the USDA germplasm facility there, and plums and grapes also from Nick Botner's and other places, and they'd all be brought to this event and shared. And it was Lane County Propagation Fair evolved out of the Eugene Permaculture Guild seed swaps, the Food Not Lawn seed swaps that were happening there. And it was inspired by the Home Orchard Society Plant Propagation Fair, which happens every year at Clackamas Community College, and it's been going on for 45 years. I'm also on the board of the Home Orchard Society and involved in that as well. But at this time, I was just doing the Lane County Propagation Fair, and when we did the event in 2016, Nick and I were driving in the car together after the event, and he was dismayed and I was dismayed in different ways. We kind of felt like the event had become this thing where there was a small subset of people that organized the event, and then the community would rush in and not really act like some people would, but not everybody would act like it was a community event. They'd be like, "Get out of my way" at the seed table, I'm going to take this entire packet of seeds, it's all free, it's all mine, get out of here, and people would rush in the door to get scion and get trees grafted, and it wasn't community focused. It was kind of like a grab, smash, and go. And so one of the ideas that Nick had to fix that was to basically make the event more neighborhood focused, and bring it back to a recognition that it's as much about the people as it's about the plants. And so, we come together to share all this biodiversity, but we're ostensibly doing it because we want to enrich our community's quality of life. And so we sat down, and over a couple weeks we hatched out a plan to basically create small neighborhood-focused bioregional events throughout Western Oregon. And so kind of focused around people, potluck, that we make them smaller. We actually, believe it or not, we wanted to advertise them less. We wanted to bring the people. The idea was that the quality people are going to find out about it, and they're going to want to be involved. And the other look-see people, or the people that want to come for a spectacle, we don't really want those people to be there. I mean, it doesn't mean that they're not worthy or anything like that, but it just means that they're not really going to contribute as much to the community aspect of the event. So that's kind of how we started it. And since then, it's grown into 7 events that happen throughout Western Oregon and one in Western Washington. And it's spawned off a whole bunch of seed swaps and different things like that. And so we still go around and collect a huge amount of biodiversity of apples, pears, grapes. I've done willows and pomegranates in the past. Gummy berry, kiwi. Let's see what else. Plums, peaches, apricots, cherries. And, we buy in rootstock. It happens that, Oregon happens to be kind of in the world centers for rootstock. So we have all this like quality, clean rootstock available. And so we buy that in, and for a nominal price, people can get trees, grafted up, and that's by donation. And then the rootstock is I think it's like $3. And so you basically get a tree for like $5, and all grafted up with a little care, little aftercare sheet, and you get to hang out with your neighbors and enjoy some of the things that people have brought for potluck. But now that COVID has come into the scene, we had to change this year. We had to kind of change it up. So we had all this rootstock that we had ordered all the way back in August when you put in your orders. And so we were like, man, we're going to get screwed. What are we going to do? So what we did is we decided to have like a decentralized propagation fair in a couple different places where we put everything up online, and people ordered, they ordered and paid for the trees that they wanted, and then they came and they picked them up at different set times. So we could do like social distancing and stuff like that, and we could be like, hey, you're Johnson here for your 5 fruit trees and your fig cuttings. Okay, well, we put all your fig cuttings and the scion that you wanted to graft at home in your bag, and with your grafted trees that you wanted grafted, and here you go. So we kind of changed the model around a little bit, but obviously we hope next year that we can get back to normal or more normal like events, community events. But one of the things that has driven the ASN for me has been taking all this edible fruit research, and so I've been going through the USDA's collection of pears in 5 different ripening windows, and going through their 2,200 accessions and looking at each pear, and then taking. I go to like my local grocery store and I buy like 200 paper bags, and then I have like a bunch of magic markers in my pocket, and I run through the rows and I'm like, oh, this one's good, and so I'll put I'll put some pears in a bag and write the name on there. And then pretty soon I have maybe like 70, 80, 150, 50 accessions of pears. And so I'll bring those back. And many years I've had tastings, and other years I've just kind of had informal tastings at the farm with friends. And I try those over the next few weeks. And then I go back out there again, and I collect more pears, see what's ripe. It's usually a completely different set of pears. And I've looked at ripening windows from middle July to late November and tried to figure out, okay, what are the best disease-resistant pears that have the best flavor, best storability characteristics, that sort of thing. In all these different ripening windows. And then from those, I have a database I created of all that information. And then I look and I say, like, okay, what are like the top 60 pears I want to collect scion for the community, for these community events? So I go in and I collect scion. And then we have a day where, we bring all the scion, and a whole bunch of people, we distribute it into different bundles, and we record what bundles are going to what groups, and so that we can figure out what kind of rootstock we're going to send to different groups. And we tailor that rootstock. So, like more urban settings, we have more dwarf, semi-dwarf species. More rural settings, maybe we'll have more full-size standard stuff. So I've been doing that work with pears. And then I've also looked at gone through and looked at the entire kiwi collection. And then I've gone down to Nick Botner's orchard for years now, looking at his collection. And unfortunately, my hero, he passed away this year. And so I didn't really do any scion collection this year. I was just kind of supporting my other hero, his wife, Carla, because, again, it goes back to it's as much about the people as it's about the plants. And Nick Botner's collection of apples is not just a collection of apples. There's a story behind it. There's people behind it, that are worthy of care and love and respect, and but for many years I've gone there, and I've looked at apples in seven different ripening windows, from late June, early July to December, and looked at what apples are hanging. What are the best red flesh apples? What are the best apples that are bright yellow inside or dark orange? What are the apples that store the best? What are the most unique apples? What are the most disease-resistant apples? One year we did a study where, we had like 25 different people help us. When we went systematically through the orchard, and we looked at every single tree, and we determined a collection of maybe about 350 trees out of the 4,500. Well, there's about 6,000 trees there or more. But out of the 4,500 varieties, which trees had the best anthracnose resistance? Because anthracnose is a really big problem for fruit trees and nut trees. And so we created like a subset of that, maybe like the top 40 trees that, had very little anthracnose on them. And we found 3 trees which had almost no or no anthracnose on them, which was pretty interesting. One was Robinson crab, which has many different crabapple species in it, and it's actually it's a red-fleshed crab that was developed as a street tree, and it produces apples ultra early, and they're not very good, but it could be used in crosses for extreme disease resistance, because it's been bred for like disease resistance of nearly every type. Another was this one called Rex Applegate, which the Applegate family had settled there. They were like one of the first people to come up in a wagon trail up to this place in Southern Oregon called Yoncalla. And so Nick Botner moved, and Carla Botner, they moved and they set up their orchard pretty much at the terminus of this wagon trail. And there was a guy that lived next door that was one of the Applegates, who was like a general in World War II. And Nick Botner had been a soldier in World War II, so they were friends. And Rex was into apples, and Nick loved apples. And so he collected these 2 apples from his yard, which were seedlings that were good. And one was Rex Applegate 1 and Rex Applegate 2. Well, it turns out Rex Applegate 2 was one of the very best disease-resistant apples in his whole orchard. And it's just this, it's just a testament to the fact that we need to adapt our biodiversity to where we live. A one-size-fits-all biodiversity doesn't work. You can't grow the same corn every single climate. You got to have corn that's well adapted to your climate. So anyway, that's kind of like a little rundown of the ASN.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing organization. A lot of what you said sounds very much like the MOFGA / Maine Tree Crop Alliance Seed and Scion Exchange, which is a big annual event that this year, just like your big events, was disrupted by the pandemic, but was able to adapt enough to still happen in some form.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully that adaptation will be easier next year, and it'll be more able to hang out and have the community aspect of it.
Yeah. That was one of the reasons why I added you to the Agrarian Sharing Network. I added when I created the Agrarian Sharing Network page. Its primary focus is people in the Pacific Northwest, and I kind of have the cutoff. Maybe people there's a bunch of people in the Bay Area doing cool stuff, so I let them join. And then there's people up in British Columbia and Alaska doing cool stuff, so I let them join. So it's kind of like but it's mostly like Oregon, Washington, Northern California focused, like Northern California focused group. But I added all my favorite plant collaborators like you, Aaron, because I knew that we would be able to synergize, and between groups. So, I'd
sure.
love to work better with in deeper capacity with MOFGA and some of the other Scion affairs that are going on around the country. And Maine is a special place in that way, and that you have such a strong plant propagation fair. It besides Oregon, Washington, California, and Maine, I mean, there aren't too many other places that have Scion fairs that I can think of that are so vibrant.
Yeah, I think there's another one in Pennsylvania, but yeah, there are large parts of the country where that just doesn't exist.
Yeah, and really, this model, the Agrarian Sharing Network model, for the last couple of years, we've been focusing on trying to modularize it more and more, and to basically record the various aspects of what does it take to put on a Scion exchange, a plant propagation fair. Like what kind of people do you need? What resources do you need? Like actual resource, like what how many pens do you need? How many tables do you need? How many cups to hold Scion do you need? Like prep cups, like restaurant prep cups, stuff like that. And so we've been documenting that more and more, and it's been a test run as we've kind of handed off the ropes to the Agrarian Sharing Network Redmond, Washington event, because until recently I haven't lived up here for 8 years.
So the first year, Nick and I, we went up, 2 years ago, we went up and we helped throw the event up here. But this year, we handed off more delegation to our friend Jason Podorvik, and he took the ball and ran with it. And so I look forward to getting involved with the ASN up here in Washington. But the goal that I see is to make a food not bombs type model. So as long as people adhere to the ethos of food not bombs, they can throw a food not bombs event anywhere. It doesn't matter. And so I kind of see ASN as the same kind of thing, that as long as people adhere to a post-religious, post-monetary, post-political reality at the events, that we don't charge entry, that we don't promote any political candidates or any political cause, even if it's a gardening cause, even if it's like, don't spray the forest plantations. We had an issue with that, with people saying, oh, it's aligned with what you're doing. Why aren't you letting us be in? Like, that's great. I'm pro not spraying large swaths of the land aerially. Like that's obvious. That's like QED. That's obvious. We shouldn't be doing that. But your candidacy sounds great. I'm glad that you are promoting environmental causes. That's wonderful. I'm on board with you. Just don't advertise here. This is not the place for it. So we've been trying to create a model that can be extended anywhere. So I'd love to see Agrarian Sharing Network events by ASN name or another name, and be spread all over the country where there aren't events. So a little bit more about that post-religious, post-political, post-monetary system that we're trying to create, at least at these events. So right now I have friends on the left, friends on the right, and it's gotten to the point where we're just so tribalized and polarized. People are fighting with each other all the time. And meanwhile, if you ask people basic questions like, do you love your family, or oh yeah, man, I love pizza too, or when I'm done working, I love to have a beer. It's when you ask a random American, hey, what do you like? It turns out, maybe they like Biden, maybe they like Trump, maybe they like somebody else. But when you really get down to their basic needs and their basic wants, we're a lot more similar than we are different. And I want to, while the differences are real and, they can be discussed somewhere else, I want to create a space, and we've created spaces where some rural logger can be with an environmentalist hippie, and they can sit down at the same table, where a Trump supporter and a Hillary supporter could sit down at the same table, and they'd be like, oh yeah, man, I love these types of beets. These beets are awesome. Or yeah, Gold Rush is my favorite apple. Yeah, man, I love Gold Rush, or whatever. So trying to create that where, a Christian can sit down with an atheist and they can find common ground, and where people can come together and remember what it's like to be a human being and what it's like to live in community, and be amongst people that think differently or believe differently or look differently than each other, in a real tangible way. That's kind of world that I've wanted to help foster, and Nick and the other core collaborators have wanted to try to foster with the ASN, is this kind of transcendent space where in one time we transcend our beliefs and our identities, but in another token, we also come together and we recognize our common humanity. So,
and also transcend the economy and, creating a commons. It's awesome. Those kinds of projects are amazing. That's a beautiful project.
Thanks, Tim.
Beautiful notions. Well, we're at like what, an hour and 45 minutes now. So, yeah, I don't know. Any, any closing thoughts on all this stuff?
Well, I guess to speak about economy, though we all have to survive, I have to eat. So if you want, check out my seed at the Experimental Farm Network and Homesteader's Perennial Kale. It still supports me in my efforts, and it's greatly appreciated. Even with my discussion about post-economy, we still need money in some way at this time. So anyway,
this is a very nuanced podcast, so you can, we like nuance here.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you guys have any questions about kale or perennial kale or sea kale or?
I feel like I know everything.
I think you covered it very well.
I feel like I could get a fucking A+ on that shit. I mean, the only other question I had was like, if you've ever messed around with 9-star broccoli.
I have years ago. It turned out all the stuff was in the United States that was available were like old seed lots that were inbred. And Mandy over Incredible Vegetables over in the UK, she was actually able to find I think it was something like a 20-year-old seed lot of non-inbred, messed up form of 9-star, and was able to get a seed lot out of it. So I'm curious to see what happens from that. You take back, you go back 50 years, and there were a number of different forms of 9-star was just a whole series of these stars. There's another one that I had that was kind of perennial years ago called Maystar. It was a huge, vigorous plant. Made massive cauliflower heads. It was overwintering cauliflower. But yeah, there were a lot of overwintering cauliflowers and broccolis until recently. And one of them that actually I grow that hopefully I'll have a seed lot next year of. I've been doing work for years to rescue it. Is called Purple Cape, and so I have a perennial form of Purple Cape. The Purple Cape that is normally available is not perennial, but this one will actually produce heads for 3 years. So it would be cool to eventually cross the 9-star with the Purple Cape. That's what I would like to do. Yeah. Anyway, I hope one day 9-star is available in the United States.
Cool. Any idea how hardy 9-star is?
Any of your cauliflowers are not going to be able to do much past zone 8. Yeah, they're just cauliflowers in general are not very hardy. Yeah.
I feel like it's like 9 or 7 or something. I don't know. I'm gonna try it in the greenhouse. Just fuck it. But we'll see. All right. Well. Yeah. Well, I don't know. Aaron, anything else, or should we go play in the water? Whatever.
Yeah, I feel like I'm about ready to go back outside.
Awesome. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on here and sharing all this information with us, for just all this incredible work. I can't even fathom comparing 4,500 trees. That's just it's just it's so intense. But yeah, man, thank you for coming on here, and thank you and my family, especially my kale-eating son, thanks you for your Western Front perennial kale, for sure.
Well, I didn't. That's Tim Peters. Western Front.
I'm sorry. I meant to say Kaleidoscopic Grex. That's what I was growing here mostly. I was just looking at the piece of paper. Yeah, I was looking at I've written Western Front Perennial while we were talking. So
no worries, man. Thanks for your kind words. I appreciate it. And I had a fun time today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for all the info. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah.